Well, 6 o'clock, 6:01. Excuse me, obviously it's time for tales and cocktails. Excuse me. Oh, this weather. And speaking of the weather, nice little segue here. I'm reminded immediately of the winter coming and frozen ponds and frozen rinks. Pretty soon, if not already, the Wallman Rink, the Rockefeller Center Rink, and others in New York will be open for ice skating. A joy I never knew as a child because I grew up in Hampton, Virginia, and we were right where the mouth of the James River, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean came together. So with the changing weather cycles over the years, we had very little snow and ice when I was growing up. But there had been lots before, and there were stories of automobiles going across the ice from Hampton to Norfolk, all the way across the mouth of the James River. Anyway, it's reminded me of ice skating, which I didn't know, and therefore I went to Charles Dickens to look up her segment from the Pickwick Papers of Mr. Pickwick on the Ice. The Pickwick Papers are absolutely delightful. If you don't remember them or if you haven't read them, it's time to take a visit again. Let me just say a little read up about Dickens. Some of Dickens's so-called novels are not novels in the strict sense of the word, but rather a series of sketches unified by the characters running through them. Of these, Pickwick Papers, which established the author's reputation, is the funniest. London used to wait breathlessly for further installments of the ridiculous experiences of the Pickwick Club. This club consists of a leader, the benign Mr. Pickwick, and 3 members distinguished for their absurdities: Tupman, Snodgrass, and Winkle. The 4 set off on a journey of investigation and discovery through England. Accompanying Mr. Pickwick is Sam Weller, the inimitable Cockney servant. After many amusing adventures, they become acquainted with Mr. Wardle, a hospitable old country squire who invites them to spend Christmas with him at Manor Farm. The persons they meet there and the athletic catastrophes of the day form the subject of this favorite bit. From the Pickwick Papers, Mr. Pickwick on the Ice. Old Wardle led the way to a pretty large sheet of ice, and the fat boy and Mr. Weller, having shoveled and swept away the snow which had fallen on it during the night, Mr. Bob Sawyer adjusted his skates with a dexterity which, to Mr. Winkle, was perfectly marvelous, and described circles with his left leg, and cut figures of 8, and inscribed upon the ice, without once stopping for breath, a great many other pleasant and astonishing devices, to the excessive satisfaction of Mr. Pickwick, Mr. Tupman, and the ladies, which reached a pit of positive enthusiasm when old Wardle and Benjamin Allen, assisted by the aforesaid Bob Sawyer, performed some mystic evolutions which they called a reel. All this time, Mr. Winkle, with his face and hands blue with the cold, had been forcing a gimlet onto the soles of his feet and putting his skates on with the points behind and getting the straps into a very complicated and entangled state, with the assistance of Mr. Snodgrass, who knew rather less about skates than a Hindu. At length, however, with the assistance of Mr. Weller, the unfortunate skates were firmly screwed and buckled on, and Mr. Winkle was raised to his feet. "Now then," said Sam in an encouraging tone, "off with you, and show 'em how to do it." "Stop, Sam, stop," said Mr. Winkle, trembling violently, and clutching hold of Sam's arms with the grasp of a drowning man. "How slippery it is, Sam!" "Not an uncommon thing upon ice, sir," replied Mr. Weller. "Hold up, sir." This last observation of Mr. Weller's bore reference to a demonstration Mr. Winkle made at the instant of a frantic desire to throw his feet in the air and dash the back of his head on the ice. These are very awkward skates, ain't they, Sam? Inquired Mr. Winkle, staggering. I'm afeard there's an awkward gentleman in 'em, sir, replied Sam. Now, Winkle, cried Mr. Pickwick, quite unconscious there was anything the matter. Come, the ladies are all anxiety. Yes, replied Mr. Winkle with a ghastly smile. I'm coming. Just a-going to begin, said Sam, endeavoring to disengage himself. Now, sir, start off. Stop an instant, Sam, gasped Mr. Winkle. What, Sam? You may have them, Sam. Thank you, sir, replied Mr. Weller. Never mind touching your hat, Sam, said Mr. Winkle hastily. You needn't take your hand away to do that. I meant to have given you 5 shillings this morning for a Christmas box, Sam. I'll give it to you this afternoon, Sam. You're very good, sir, replied Mr. Weller. Just hold me at first, Sam, will you? Said Mr. Winkle. There, that's right. I shall soon get in the way of it, Sam. Not too fast, Sam. Not too fast. Mr. Winkle, stooping forward with his body half doubled up, was being assisted over the ice by Mr. Weller in a very singular and unswan-like manner. When Mr. Pickwick most innocently shouted from the opposite bank, Sam! Sir, said Mr. Weller, here, I want you. Let go, sir, said Sam. Don't you hear the governor calling? Let go, sir. With a violent effort, Mr. Weller disengaged himself from the grasp of the agonized Pickwickian, and in so doing administered a considerable impetus to the unhappy Mr. Winkle, with an accuracy which no degree of dexterity or practice could have ensured. That unfortunate gentleman bore swiftly down into the center of the reel at the very moment when Mr. Bob Sawyer was performing a flourish of unparalleled beauty. Mr. Winkle struck wildly against him, and with a loud crash, they both fell heavily down. Mr. Pickwick ran to the spot. Bob Sawyer had risen to his feet, but Mr. Winkle was far too wise to do anything of the kind in skates. He was seated on the ice, making spasmodic efforts to smile, but anguish was depicted on every lineament of his countenance. Are you hurt? Inquired Mr. Benjamin Allen with great anxiety. Not much, said Mr. Winkle, rubbing his back very hard. I wish you'd let me bleed you, said Mr. Benjamin with great eagerness. No, thank you, replied Mr. Winkle hurriedly. I really think you had better, said Allen. Thank you, replied Mr. Winkle. I'd rather not. What do you think, Mr. Pickwick? Inquired Bob Sawyer. Mr. Pickwick was excited and indignant. He beckoned to Mr. Weller and said in a stern voice, Take his skates off. Yeah, that's better. No, but really, I had scarcely begun, remonstrated Mr. Winkle. Take his skates off, repeated Mr. Pickwick firmly. The command was not to be resisted. Mr. Winkle allowed Sam to obey it in silence. Lift him up, said Mr. Pickwick. Sam assisted him to rise. Mr. Pickwick retired a few paces apart from the bystanders, and beckoning his friend to approach, fixed a searching look upon him, and uttered in a low but distinct and emphatic tone these remarkable words. You're a humbug, sir. A what? Said Mr. Winkle, starting. A humbug, sir. I will speak plainer, if you wish it. An impostor, sir. With these words, Mr. Pickwick turned slowly on his heel and rejoined his friends. While Mr. Pickwick was delivering himself of the sentiment just recorded, Mr. Weller and the fat boy, having by their joint endeavors cut out a slide, were exercising themselves thereupon in a very masterly and brilliant manner. Sam Weller, in particular, was displaying that beautiful feat of fancy sliding which is currently denominated knocking at the cobbler's door, and which is achieved by skimming over the ice on one foot and occasionally giving a twopenny postman's knock upon it with the other. It was a good long slide, and there was something in the motion which Mr. Pickwick, who was very cold with standing still, could not help envying. "It looks a nice, warm exercise, that, doesn't it?" he inquired of Wardle, when that gentleman was thoroughly out of breath by reason of the indefatigable manner in which he had converted his legs into a pair of compasses and drawn complicated problems on the ice. "Ah, it does indeed," replied Warden. "Do you slide?" "I used to do, on the gutters, when I was a boy," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Try it now," said Wardle. "Oh, do please, Mr. Pickwick," cried all the ladies. "I should be very happy to afford you any amusement," replied Mr. Pickwick, "but I haven't done such a thing these 30 years. "Pooh, pooh, nonsense," said Wardle, dragging off his skates with the impetuosity which characterized all his proceedings. "Here, I'll keep you company. Come along." And away went the good-tempered old fellow down the slide with a rapidity which came very close upon Mr. Weller and beat the fat boy all to nothing. Mr. Pickwick paused, considered, pulled off his gloves and put them in his hat, took 2 or 3 short runs, balked himself, as often, and at last took another run and went slowly and gravely down the slide, with his feet about 1.25 yards apart, amidst the gratified shouts of all the spectators. "Keep the pot a-bilin', sir," said Sam. And down went Wardle again, and then Mr. Pickwick, and then Sam, and then Mr. Winkle, and then Mr. Bob Sawyer, and then the fat boy, and then Mr. Snodgrass, following closely upon each other's heels, and running after each other with as much eagerness as if all their future prospects in life depended on their expedition. It was the most intensely interesting thing to observe the manner in which Mr. Pickwick performed his share in the ceremony, to watch the torture of anxiety with which he viewed the person behind, gaining upon him at the imminent hazard of tripping him up, to see him gradually expend the painful force which he had put on at first, and turn slowly round on the slide, with his face toward the point from which he had started, to contemplate the playful smile which mantled on his face when he had accomplished the distance, and the eagerness with which he turned round when he had done so and ran after his predecessor, his black gaiters tripping pleasantly through the snow, and his eyes beaming cheerfulness and gladness through his spectacles. And when he was knocked down, which happened upon the average every 3rd round, it was the most invigorating sight that can possibly be imagined to behold him gather up his hat, gloves, and handkerchief with a glowing countenance, and resume his station in the rank with an order and enthusiasm that nothing could slate. The sport was at its height, the sliding was at its quickest, the laughter was at the loudest, when a sharp, smart crack was heard. There was a quick rush toward the bank, a wild scream from the ladies, and a shout from Mr. Tubman. A large mass of ice disappeared. The water bubbled up over it. Mr. Pickwick's hat, gloves, and handkerchief were floating on the surface. And that was all of Mr. Pickwick that anybody could see. Dismay and anguish were depicted on every countenance. The males turned pale, and the females fainted. Mr. Snodgrass and Mr. Winkle grasped each other by the hand and gazed at the spot where their leader had gone down with frenzied eagerness, while Mr. Tupman, by way of rendering the promptest assistance, and at the same time conveying to any persons who might be within hearing the clearest possible notion of the catastrophe, ran off across the country at his utmost speed, screaming, "Fire!" with all his might. It was at this very moment when old Wardle and Sam Weller were approaching the hole with cautious steps, and Mr. Benjamin Allen was holding a hurried consultation with Mr. Bob Sawyer on the advisability of bleeding the company generally, as an improving little bit of professional practice. It was at this very moment that a face, head, and shoulders emerged from beneath the water and disclosed the features and spectacles of Mr. Pickwick. "Keep yourself up for an instant, for only one instant," bawled Mr. Snodgrass. "Yes, do, let me implore you, for my sake," roared Mr. Winkle, deeply affected. The adjuration was rather unnecessary, the probability being that if Mr. Pickwick had declined to keep himself up for anybody else's sake, it would have occurred to him that he might as well do so for his own. "Do you feel the bottom there, old fellow?" said Wardle. "Yes, certainly," replied Mr. Pickwick, wringing the water from his head and face and gasping for breath. I fell upon my back. I couldn't get on my feet at first." The clay upon so much of Mr. Pickwick's coat as was yet visible bore testimony to the accuracy of this statement, and as the fears of the spectators were still further relieved by the fat boys suddenly recollecting that the water was nowhere more than 5 feet deep, prodigies of valor were performed to get him out. After a vast quantity of splashing and cracking and struggling, Mr. Pickwick was at length fairly extricated from his unpleasant position, and once more stood on dry land. "Oh, he'll catch his death of cold," cried Emily. "Dear old thing," said Arabella. "Let me wrap this shawl around you, Mr. Pickwick." "Aye, that's the best thing you can do," said Wardle. "And when you've got it on, run home as fast as your legs can carry you and jump into bed directly." A dozen shawls were offered on the instant. 3 or 4 of the thickest having been selected, Mr. Pickwick was wrapped up and started off under the guidance of Mr. Weller, presenting the singular phenomenon of an elderly gentleman dripping wet and without a hat, with his arms bound down to his sides, skimming over the ground without any clearly defined purpose, at the rate of 6 good English miles an hour. But Mr. Pickwick cared not for appearances in such an extreme case, and urged on by Sam Weller, he kept at the very top of his speed until he reached the door of Manor Farm, where Mr. Tupman had arrived some 5 minutes before and had frightened the old lady into palpitations of the heart by impressing her with the unalterable conviction that the kitchen chimney was on fire, a calamity which always presented itself in glowing colors to the old lady's mind when anybody about her evinced the smallest agitation. Mr. Pickwick paused not an instant until he was snug in bed. Sam Weller lighted a blazing fire in the room and took up his dinner. A bowl of punch was carried up afterward, and a grand carouse was held in honor of his safety. Old Wardle would not hear of his rising, so they made the bed the chair, and Mr. Pickwick presided. A second and a third bowl were ordered in, and when Mr. Pickwick awoke next morning, there was not a symptom of rheumatism about him, which proves, as Mr. Bob Sawyer very justly observed, that there is nothing like hot punch in such cases, and that if ever hot punch did fail to act as a preventive, it was merely because the patient fell into the vulgar error of not taking enough of it. Mr. Pickwick on the Ice, from the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. I think it's wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed it, my dears. Now comes the problem of what on earth to follow it with next week. We'll figure it out. Reread the Pickwick Papers by all means. I intend to do so. It's been far too long. And that's it for Tales and Cocktails. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. See you next week. Bye now.